for me.
Oops. Hi, Natalie. You know that. And you leave or stay, but we wanted to make sure that we had this available to other folks after the fact who weren't able to join. And if you can just take a peek at Rebecca's notes right there, if you could just mute yourself while the speakers are talking. We do have a small period at the end of this conversation for questions. It is kind of short, so we'll do our best to answer all the questions, but whatever we can't answer, I will definitely get back to you later if there's a question that was not asked. So still feel free to put it in the chat box. So Rebecca, if you could go to my slides. So welcome to everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Tina Zook. I'm the Government Relations Director for the American Heart Association in Vermont. Why we decided to hold this event today is we're very concerned about all flavored tobacco in Vermont, both flavored e-cigarettes and menthol combustibles. But we feel like everyone kind of has a handle or a good picture of what's happening with e-cigarettes and the vaping crisis that's kind of hit our state just as it has with many other states. But we wanted to give some background and some education on the second part of the crisis that we believe is equally important, and that's menthol combustibles, which we would also like to see eliminated. So next slide, please. As I just mentioned, this is a really important issue to the American Heart Association, as it is to our partners in the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Vermont, the American Cancer Society, Tobacco-Free Kids, Vermont Medical Society, the Lung Association, many other organizations. There are two crises that are going on. One is the e-cigarette use by kids, which is fueled by flavors. The other is the menthol crisis, which is disproportionately impacting people of color. And you will hear from our national speakers about that today. It has to do with aggressive marketing by the tobacco industry. And we have two national experts, some legislators, and also a Vermont student, a former student, I should say, who's going to be talking about this. It's a very important issue for the American Heart Association. I'm not sure if anyone had a chance to see it yet, but every year we have our scientific sessions in November. And at that, our president released a presidential advisory on eliminating structural racism. And we feel strongly that eliminating the sale of menthol tobacco products is an important step in accomplishing that goal. Even in Vermont, this is a problem, as you know, you've heard with COVID, but concerning tobacco, as you'll see in this bullet point, while the adult smoking rate in general in Vermont is 15%, for people of color, it's 26%. And youth of color are almost 2 times more likely to smoke than white students. Next slide. Now, why menthol is even important in this conversation? You know, the main reason is what I just said, but for some background, in 2009, there was a federal law called the Tobacco Control Act that outlawed most flavored cigarettes, but it exempted menthol due to the tobacco industry lobbying. That's really troubling because menthol makes cigarettes easier to smoke and harder to quit. And the industry documents show that companies manipulate the menthol to reinforce smoking behavior and increase the ease of smoking, with youth especially, right? It has that cooling effect that makes it easier to smoke. Now, menthol currently makes up about 35% of the US cigarette market. It's big business for the tobacco industry. We don't want it to be big business here in Vermont. I think kind of a shocking figure that we should give some weight to is that Vermont currently spends about $348 million every year just treating the diseases caused by tobacco, and $87 million of those are Medicaid expenses. Next slide. So youth are one of the areas that are that's targeted by the tobacco industry because of the cooling effect that I mentioned. More than 54% of youth who smoke cigarettes use menthol. And for Black youth, it's 7 out of 10. And we'll hear more about that from our national speakers. Next slide. And what we're talking about today is we really want to ensure racial equity with this issue because of this marketing by the tobacco industry. For Black smokers, 85% smoke menthol, and a higher percentage of Black adults who smoke started by using menthol cigarettes, 93%, than whites who smoke. Next slide. The reason why we want to pass legislation at the local level, and somebody's not on mute, so if we could just mute, we're hearing a little bit of clicking noises. What the same federal law that I mentioned that banned all flavored cigarettes except for menthol gave the FDA the authority to regulate menthol as well. It has commissioned 2 reports. One of the things they concluded was that the removal of menthol cigarettes from the marketplace would benefit public health, and thousands of lives would be saved. Almost a third of those would be Black lives. We also know that if menthol cigarettes were removed from the marketplace, 39% of menthol smokers would stop, 45% of menthol smokers would quit, and 65% of young menthol smokers report they would try to quit. Still, the FDA hasn't acted, and it's been 11 years. Next slide. So it's really important for states to act to prevent this crisis. So far, only 2 have. Massachusetts and California have both passed legislation preventing the sale of both flavored e-cigarettes and menthol combustibles. We supported legislation that was introduced last year in Vermont in the House by both Representatives Brumstead and Till, and in the Senate by Senator Lyons, where it began to advance prior to COVID. And we're pleased that they will be introducing this legislation again, and we fully support it. And with that, I'd like to introduce our first speaker, who is Senator Ginny Lyons. Ginny Lyons represents Chittenden County in the Vermont Senate. She chairs the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. She's a professor of biology who researched chronic disease prevention and issues of equality in science. During her career, Senator Lyons developed a health clinic for migrant children and families. She established the Diversity Committee for a national scientific professional organization. Some of her legislation includes smoke-free buildings, raising the smoking age to 21, reducing toxic chemicals in consumer products, and trauma-informed initiatives. Senator Lyons champions evidence-based legislation for a commitment to people, the environment, and public health prevention. She brings a unique scientific perspective to her legislative work, and we're happy that she can join us today.
Thank you, Tina, and thank you to the Heart Association for hosting this webinar. Thank you also to my peers in both the House and Senate, especially Dr. Till and Jessica Brumstead. And I'd also like to thank the Department of Health, who continue to give strong support to this issue. Response to COVID has overshadowed the ongoing public health crisis of the effects of flavors in tobacco and e-cigarettes. Indeed, COVID has more than likely exacerbated people's health responses during the pandemic. By unanimous vote, Senate Health and Welfare Committee passed a solid bill to ban flavored tobacco and e-liquids at the end of January 2020. The bill then remained in Senate Finance Committee, where it was left during COVID. I and others are reintroducing the bill during the coming session. We deliberate legislation using data, evidence-informed or based policy decisions, including basic medical, behavioral, and health scientific information to justify our work. Vermont is fortunate to have such researchers as Drs. Vellante, Bell, Farisi, and Gogo, among many others, to help us. Next slide, please. Not everyone has access to health care in our state, but everyone has a right to be healthy. When specific populations are targeted for flavored products, they become vulnerable to diseases. A menthol and flavor ban will build an equal opportunity for health. Non-flavored tobacco use is declining, while menthol tobacco use is rising, especially among Blacks, Latinos, women, and the LGBTQ community. This gives a head start to acquiring the deadly diseases and addiction associated with these products. Between 2017 and 19, menthol e-cigarette use increased by over 20% to a total of 64% of the total. Today, many flavors continue to attract kids. the effects of smoking continue with lung disease, cardiovascular disease, and so on. The inclusion of menthol, particularly in tobacco, is the preferred flavor for many. Menthol masks, we know a lot about masks today, but menthol is an insidious mask. It masks the harshness of tobacco as it's inhaled. Trachea, bronchi, and lungs are still abused as coughing is suppressed. It also makes it harder to quit because it's easier to smoke. This presents an argument that we heard many times. Older adult smokers need menthol in order to quit. Does this mask the reality of quitting addiction? We are hard-pressed to find justification for the assertion. Mr. Jefferson can identify appropriate quitline and other policy initiatives to help people limit access to flavors. Flavors overall are hugely attractive to kids, and Dr. Gardner can illustrate how this attraction is perpetuated by the tobacco industry. University of Vermont's Dr. Volonte shared her data demonstrating that the use of menthol cigarettes is on the rise in Black, Latino, and other populations. 9 in 10 African-American smokers aged 12 and over use menthol cigarettes. LGBTQ students in Vermont are more likely than their peers to use flavored products. Black adults have the highest percentage of menthol use as compared with other groups. This begins with youth. Youth e-cigarette use increased 36% in 1 year, 2016 to 2017. The increase in the use of flavors continues to grow in younger populations, setting up a lifetime of addiction and negative health issues. 92% of young adults report using flavored products, fruit and menthol. A ban on flavors can have tremendous impact on population and health improvement. Convincing legislators that long-term gains can compensate for short-term revenue losses is a consistent challenge. Long-term and short-term economic gains and losses frequently drive decisions in the legislature. Prevention is a long-term policy process. It is estimated by eliminating flavors from the market, we can save up to $348 million a year just in our healthcare dollars alone. An assessment of yearly losses of state revenue, menthol and other flavors, is about $5.45 million a year. Menthol flavored cigarettes represent the bulk of the revenue loss, $3.56 million. So if we exclude menthol, maybe it means we get more revenue each year. But over time, we sacrifice significant amounts of healthcare dollars. If menthol continues to be marketed, won't use increase? And the answer is yes. The balance of economic data frequently colors decisions in the legislature. The argument for prevention needs to be compelling. COVID has awakened many to the need for public health policies, and in particular for healthcare equity and racial equity. Finally, we need to eliminate penalties for possession of tobacco products for younger folks. As one senator said in our committee, we don't need to leave penalties on the books, justifying more traffic stops of Black kids. We hope to remove purchase, use, and possession laws that may disproportionately affect our community of color. And we do have a very strong community of color, as you will hear a little bit later on. In my own district, we have 79 different languages, many of which are from an African-American population. Now you have a flavor of some of the information that helps us make our decisions in the legislature, and we can turn to the real experts. Next slide, please. It really is a privilege to introduce two amazing people. Dr. Philip Gardner is a public health activist, administrator, evaluator, and researcher. For the past 25 years, he has worked on studies ranging from hypertension, multiculturalism, and AIDS to breast cancer, prostate cancer, diabetes, and smoking. For the past 20 years, Dr. Gardner has lectured around the country on African American health disparities generally and menthol smoking in the Black community particularly. Dr. Gardner recently retired as the Senior Program Officer for the Tobacco-Related Disease Research Program, University of California Office of the President, a position he had been in since 1997. Dr. Gardner is currently the co-chair of the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, a group of Black professionals dedicated to fighting the scourge of tobacco impacting African American communities, both in California and nationally. Delmonte Jefferson is the executive director of the Center for Black Health and Equity, a national organization that facilitates public health programs to benefit communities and people of African descent. He has worked for more than 20 years in public health program administration, managing and directing public health programs nationally and in states such as North Carolina, Louisiana, and Georgia. He has worked with national, state, and local legislators to help shape policies in support of smoke-free establishments and restrictions on the sale of menthol and other flavored tobacco products. Mr. Jefferson is chair of the Georgia Smoke-Free Tobacco Coalition and an officer on the board of directors with the North American Quitline Consortium. He has collaborated with a cross-section of public, government, and private sector entities to create programs and services that promote health justice for marginalized communities and disenfranchised populations. Thank you both for being here. We truly look forward to your wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lyons. And now on to Dr. Gardner.
Thank you all for having me this morning. I must admit, I worked with Senator Lyon last year, or actually earlier this year, and Tina, and so I'm clearly the menthol message has gotten out there. What I'm going to do today is give kind of the backstory, which many people know and maybe many people don't know. I also want to give a shout out to my colleague, Delmonte Jefferson, who will follow me in terms of this. And lastly, before I get started, people should be aware that the AATCLC, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council, is suing the FDA for their failure to deal with the question of menthol. It's been 11 years now and going on 12. Having said that, let's go to the first slide. Next slide. Or can I? So I think the punchline in all of this, these are incidence rates of lung cancer, and unfortunately, there are too many slides like this around too many diseases where the top red line are African American males. Punchline is there are greater incidence among Black men as it relates to lung cancer. Next slide. This isn't necessarily true for African American women. They bring a whole nother dimension to it. We could show slides, whether it was about diabetes or it was about breast cancer, that wouldn't look this familiar, but their incidence rates are about the same as other groups. Next slide. Unfortunately, one way to look at these are death rates. Again, African American males are the ones dying disproportionately from this disease. One way to look at this, the gap is narrowed. The other way to look at this is that there is a gap and we need to take some responsibility for that. Next slide. Again, African American women meet the average death rate as it relates to this, but again, as we looked at other diseases, it would not look like this. Next slide. Myocardial infarction and fatal coronary heart disease incidence by race and sex and race. What's amazing about this chart, and of course, Black men, I mean, we could just go on and on about this, but Black women have higher rates of this than even white men. Next slide. This is cerebral vascular disease or stroke. Of course, the dotted line at the top and the semi-dotted line are for both Black men and Black women, have the highest degree of cerebral vascular disease. Next slide. What I'm going to suggest to you today is that the African Americanization of menthol cigarettes has been in part and parcel for what you've seen. We are into 60 years of predatory marketing and counting. Next slide. If you take anything away from this presentation today, take this slide away with you. In 1953, 5% of African Americans smoked menthol cigarettes. By 68, it had almost tripled. By 76, it had tripled again. By 2006, 82%. Today, some 85% of African American adults and some 93% of African American teens use menthol products. Next slide. The tobacco industry assault on the African American community starts in the late 1950s. Focus groups held by Brown and Williamson identified that 91% of advertising budget for TV would go to TV because Black TV watchers, the message resonated with them more than even their white counterparts. They began to use more male, I'm not there yet, excuse me, use more male actors with more Black features. They tripled cigarette advertising and ebony. They began to take over our idiom using things like menthol's got a brand new bag to, that was James Brown's thing about a brand new bag. Cool Jazz, the Cool Jazz Festival, Cool Lexicon. And unfortunately, even though there are some good things that have happened in this course of the thing, most Black groups take money from the tobacco industry. Great article by my colleague, Dr. Valerie Yerger, Smoking with the Enemy, shows this out. We've had some good exceptions. NAACP in 2016 with that.
Some of our work, my understanding is that it's really going to be looking at the work of the commission.
Someone should mute their.
Can we start this?
Okay.
Anyway, let's go on to the next slide. I'm sorry. This is from 1958. This is a Salem menthol commercial ad. Refreshes your taste. It's a white couple in a meadow. This is the way it was portrayed. Next slide. By 1963, this is Elston Howard, catcher of the New York Yankees, selling you cool cigarettes. This is in the midst of the civil rights movement. This is the March on Washington. This is what's going on. People can't ride on the bus, sit at lunch counters together. But the tobacco industry is way ahead of the curve, not only using these features, but actually hiring Black executives in North Carolina. Next slide. By the late 60s, early 70s, again, a whole new bag, the James Brown thing. Here's what we looked like, and I even looked something like that. Dashiki, beads, afro, cool ain't cold, Newport is. Next slide. By the mid-1970s, Alive with Pleasure. After all, if smoking isn't a pleasure, why bother? Of course, there's a brother in a suit on a basketball court. They're selling it to you. Next slide. Everybody got into the act. This is the late 70s. Winston's rich, real and rich and cool. Next slide. It would be important for people to understand that the 1980s and the fight for the market share, we call it the Menthol Wars. Great article again by my colleague, Dr. Valerie Yerger and colleagues. The tobacco industry had identified high traffic area, parks, they knew the street corners, they knew the daily routes. They'd have their blaring music as going up and down the street, giving away free cigarette samples, and this was being done by all the cigarette makers. I'm going to take this quick digression here. In 1979, I lived in New York City, and then 79, 80, and a little longer. I remember going to work one day and coming up out of the subway, and there was one of these vans blaring some very good music and giving away free packs of cigarettes. They were giving away cools. I was a cool smoker. I took my pack. Next slide. This is from the tobacco industry itself. And the point of this is, yes, there's the meteoric rise of Salem and the meteoric rise and decline of cool. but the steady green line here is Newport. Newport today is the #1 menthol cigarette in the Black community and in the United States generally. Next slide. This is again from the early 90s. By this time, Newport has become, yeah, as I just pointed out, the #1 cigarette. But again, here it is, fire it up. It's our idiom. Next slide. This is the early 2000s. Again, enticing, mocha taboo. Dun, 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 dun. Next slide. This is the Cool Mix campaign of 2004 that was going to be the battle for DJ to see who can scratch the best. Of course, they're aiming it at the African-American community. Next slide. Each one of the images you see on your screen was a pack of cigarettes that was being sold in the Black community in 2004. Next slide. This is 2011. I put this in here recently just to make the point that it is 60 years of predatory marketing focusing on African Americans by the tobacco industry, with the vector being of Newport mentholated cigarettes. Next slide. So let me just talk a little bit about what's in this stuff and what it does. What is menthol? Next slide. So I would argue that the ultimate candy flavoring, menthol essentially helps the poison go down easier. That's why they put it in cigarettes. It masks the harsh taste of smoking. It activates taste buds, cool receptors. There was a study done in 1998 that we funded at the University of California that showed that menthol activates the same taste buds that that hot sauce does, that capsaicin does. And we know Black folks like hot sauce. The tobacco industry knew all of this in the first thing. Of course, it has an anesthetic effect. I mean, menthol is an anesthetic chemically and by definition. It makes things easier to inhale. The easier it is to inhale, the deeper inhalation you take in, the more nicotine and toxins you take in. Mentholated cigarette smoking inhibits nicotine metabolism. When nicotine gets to your liver, it becomes cotinine. But with menthol in it, it slows down its metabolism. The punchline, it stays in your body longer. Independent sensory activation of neurotransmitters, big word saying that menthol in cigarettes create more nicotine receptors in your brain. You got more, you want more, you get more addicted. Increases salivary flow, another big word, transbucal drug absorption. The punchline there being if you chew tobacco that has menthol in it, it crosses the gum barrier much more efficiently. And probably most problematic is the greater cell permeability, meaning that if there's menthol smoke, if there's menthol in the cigarette smoke that you're smoking, it crosses the cell membrane much more efficiently than if there isn't. Next slide. This is from the tobacco industry itself, and I think, I'm sorry, the slide, when I sent the slides and whatever happened, punchline here. This is from Scientific Conference in 1993 that the tobacco industry used to hold yearly. 1993 was on menthol. The punchline of this slide is that all tobacco products contain some menthol. All. Why? Because all those effects I just told you about. And then of course, strong effect like Newports and Cools and et cetera is where we get into problems of the strong effect, making those things I talked about even more problematic. Next slide. Some of you may not know this, but that melanin is the substance that gives your color to your skin. Nicotine is actually stored in the tissues that contain melanin. The darker your skin means the more nicotine is stored in your body. Just think about it for a hot second. You're storing more nicotine in the body. It's metabolized much slower, staying in the body. The cell penetration is much greater with menthol in it. You can see the setup coming as it relates specifically, in particularly to African Americans. Next slide. Harder to quit. I think it was well said by the senator. Look, this is there. Even though this slide is about 9 years old, I still use it because it makes the point, and there's been many others that make the same point. Folks who smoke menthols try to quit more, almost 9% more. But folks who use menthol are almost 14% less likely to actually quit. The word on the street, is you're not only trying to get off cigarettes and nicotine, but you're also trying to get off menthol. Next slide. I'm going to talk a little bit about predation. This is the action of attacking or plundering where a predator, in this instance, the tobacco industry, feeds on the prey of the African American community and other marginalized groups. Next slide. It's a great slide. LaTanisha Wright worked at the tobacco industry, worked on the Cool Mix campaign, became so discouraged by quit, brought documents out. Those documents showed the tobacco industry, this is their language. They have focused communities and non-focused communities. Focused communities, of course, being inner city, colored, and poor. Non-focused communities being upscale, suburban, rural, and white. And I'll talk about the cheaper stuff later. Next slide. It's a great study done by Lisa Hendrickson at Stanford University. The punchline here is that the percentage of African American students increased, the proportion of ads, menthol ads increased. It's a dose response relationship. The more Black folks you had around schools or near Black schools, the more menthol advertising. She documents it immensely, very well. Next slide. Along with what we just said there, the proportion of menthol advertising increased by 5.9%. That's where the little bumps were. Newport promotions were 42% higher in Black areas, and the cost of Newports was 12 cents lower. Next slide. This is from Massachusetts. I'm sorry, when these slides were sent over, they obviously got disemboweled at some level, but the punchline here being that this is a study looking at comparing Brookline, an upscale white community in Boston, and Dorchester, which is changing now, but in the time 10 years ago, and the data is probably from 2005, and then historically has been a home of Black folks. The punchline here is that there are more retail ads in Dorchester. The ads are larger in Dorchester. The menthol ads are significantly, they're all significant, but this, 18% compared to 54% greater. And I guess what pisses me off the most is that menthol cigarettes are cheaper, almost to the degree of 50 cents, by 50 cents a pack in Dorchester. Next slide. The fight to ban menthol. Next slide. Menthol was a sacrificial lamb. I'm glad this was touched about earlier, and I'll just say it a little bit more pointedly. Next slide. Some would argue that it was a deal with the devil. It was not only the tobacco industry that proposed it in 2008, enacted it in 2009. It was a deal cut by Philip Morris, Southern senators, and frankly, some representatives of the tobacco control movement were in on those discussions and agreed that, it may bring out a Black market, and we can get to it later. And then since we got the menthol amendment, that made it the first order of business of the FDA's Tobacco Product Scientific Advisory Committee, we'll take it up then. The punchline is that 13 flavors were eliminated, but it excluded menthol, essentially throwing African Americans, women, youth, Native Hawaiians, Filipinos, LGBT folks, Puerto Ricans, and folks with behavioral health issues under the bus. Next slide. I'm almost done, you guys. The fight to ban menthol at the local, state, and federal level. Next slide. This is an overview of the last few years, last decade. We just mentioned the Family Smoking Prevention Act. Chicago became the first city to put a buffer zone around schools in 2013. In 2016, the deeming regulations were put out by the FDA that brought all the new products, hookah, e-cigarettes, little cigars, everything came under their rubric. They had 16 pages of glossary or appendices that argued that menthol and all flavors should be excluded. That was essentially redlined by the Office on Management and Budget. But in 2018, San Francisco became the first city to adopt citywide restrictions. We fought off the tobacco industry and continued. It continues today. Just last fall in 2009, the Pallone bill passed the U.S. House of Representatives with the help of the Congressional Black Caucus. It too calling for the you can say it, Phil, calling for the prohibition of menthol, not only in terms of sales, but in terms of manufacture. As has already been mentioned, Massachusetts became the first state in June of this year to adopt statewide menthol restriction. In June of this year, the African American Tobacco Control Leadership Council and ASH, now we've been joined by the AMA and the NMA, sued the FDA for their failure to deal with this. And lastly, California Senate Bill 793 was signed by the governor on August 28th. By August 31st, the tobacco industry filed suit that they would get a referendum to stop the implementation of this bill. They have subsequently turned in over 1 million signatures to the Secretary of State in California. They're going to block the implementation of this passage, and it will come up for a vote to the voters in 2022, meaning another 2 years in the fight around this. Next slide. Today, there are over 207 jurisdictions with flavor restrictions. 65 of them have menthol restrictions included. 2 states we've already mentioned, Massachusetts, they exempt establishments that allow smoking, and California's bill exempted hookah, premium cigars, and pipe tobaccos. Next slide, almost done. I guess the take-home message here is the disproportionate marketing and targeting of candy-flavored poison to African Americans and other especially oppressed sectors of our society is outright discriminatory and genocidal. The poorest, folks who are least informed, people with the fewest resources is indeed the definition of preying on the most vulnerable in our society. Next slide. This is a great study done. The long and short of it is if just 30% of the people who smoked menthol cigarettes quit, not leaving the other 70% to go on, if just 30% quit, over 500,000 people, over 600,000 people, lives would be saved. Over 250,000 African American lives would be saved. Next slide. What's at stake? Next slide. This is what's at stake. It's our future, it's our children. Here's a brother literally surrounded by tobacco ads. And with that, I'll stop. I want to thank you. This is how I can be reached and how my organization can be reached.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gardner. I saw there is a question or two in the chat box. We're going to save time at the end for questions so we can make sure we fit in all our speakers. As Senator Lyons mentioned, our next speaker is Delmonte Jefferson, who's the Executive Director of the Center for Black Health and Equity.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you for having me and for inviting me to be here. To follow Dr. Phil Gardner. Now that's a hard act to follow as he gave us this information and this data. It's extremely important, of course, and relevant to the conversation and the topic at hand. I'm going to talk to you briefly just about some of the work that we do that's related to this. Our organization is now called the Center for Black Health and Equity. We were formerly called the National African American Tobacco Prevention Network. And we worked right alongside Dr. Gardner in 2009, especially when menthol was excluded from the Tobacco Control Act, to actually raise a fuss and to say to the FDA and to Congress, Food and Drug Administration, to say to everyone who would listen that this is wrong, that this is a social justice issue, that you can't leave these mentholated tobacco products on the market. Next slide, please. As you guys know, I'm sure more than 45,000 African Americans die from a preventable smoking-related disease. And so we've been working since 2000 to combat this burden. And we do this at the local and the community level. We try and build the capacity of communities of color to advocate themselves. And so as you guys are moving forward in your momentum and the work that you're doing in Vermont, I am sure that you have engaged and you have brought upon with you local communities of color to be voices, to be able to say, this is what's impacting our communities and this is why it's not right. Next slide. One of the ways that we try and build capacity, we look at the intersection of health, of social justice issues and economic empowerment. They're all related. So when you talk about menthol and its impact on our communities, there's no different than the sugary sweetened beverages and that impact on our communities. There's no difference than the alcohol and the billboards and advertising and its impact on our communities. And so we have to look at that intersection. And so when we're talking about these social injustices, and then we have to do another thing. We got to partner with both traditional and non-traditional African-American civic and community-based organizations. And so, yes, we know we're going to reach out and work with the NAACP. And as Dr. Phil mentioned earlier, we were so pleased when they came aboard and joined and said, yeah, we're going to put a resolution about the sale of mentholated tobacco products and how we need to ban that. But we're just as pleased and just as excited when we get the AME Church and other church organizations and faith-based organizations to join with us in doing a No Menthol Sunday, a national day of recognition that we promote. But we're just as excited when they come on board and they participate in those efforts. But we also have to hold systems accountable, and we have to look for equitable solutions for community empowerment. And so we have to say, hey, government, if this is wrong, if this is an example of systemic racism, if this is an example of kind of continue to hold us down, then we need to call you guys out on that. We need to say that this is wrong. Next slide, please. And so our work has expanded. We look at other core influences on African-American health, including those economic situations such as, public housing, the institutional and social justice inequalities. And we look at things like, the protests that happened over the summer, the racial injustices and the protests. And we look at things like COVID-19 and its disproportionate impact on African-American populations and other communities of color. And so we have to look at how all of those things tie in together. Next slide. Because the reality of it is, and when we're talking about health inequities, and we're talking about equity in general, we can't talk about, okay, this is what we want equity, when the reality of it is that those that are least marginalized, those that are poorest, those that are burdened, keep getting further and further burdened, keep going deeper and deeper into the hole. And so that's the reality. And so it's one thing to talk about equity, and no, we don't want equality, we want equity, but we've got to really look at the reality and look at what those systems are in place that are leading to and causing this reality. Next slide, please. So, why do we focus on menthol? When we're talking about health equity and building capacity and the like, and it's a simple reason. Menthol is focused on us. Dr. Phil gave you example after example of how the predatory marketing and targeting in African-American communities and other color has been going on for 60 plus years. They've been focusing on us. The Surgeon General's report that came out in 2012, and we just look at this report and we say, here's the Surgeon General, and they gave instance after instance. We just pulled out a few, but there were multiple instances, even in this report, as far back as 2012, where the Surgeon General talked about the targeting of the industry in our communities. Now, the Surgeon General's report talked about this on one hand, but again, their sister organization, the FDA and the Center for Tobacco Products, did not ban it and still hadn't banned it and still hadn't regulated it. And so it was very interesting dynamic that you've got one agency from the federal government saying this is wrong, here's your evidence, and the other saying, well, give us more evidence, what do you have? Next slide, please. And then quite frankly, the industry has said it itself when they came up with 15,000 different flavors, for e-cigs. 15, why do we need 15,000 flavors? Some people would say, well, why do we need any flavors? But why do you need 15,000 flavors if it's not to draw kids to e-cigs and other flavored tobacco products so that the nicotine could hook them? So the 15,000 flavors will draw the kids, the nicotine itself will hook them. In addition, next slide, please. In addition, we talk about messaging and getting members of our own community to be voice pieces for the industry. Now, this is crucial because, you know, even as far back as 2009, and it may not have been Al Sharpton, but there were other African-American groups. And just like Dr. Phil said, that there were these tobacco control advocates that were at the table when menthol was used as the sacrificial lamb. There were also African-American organizations that also clearly voice opposition, you know, to removing menthol. So they wanted menthol to stay. Reverend Al Sharpton, you know, when we were looking at efforts in New York City, he initially argued that this proposal could lead to more Black New Yorkers being targeted and harassed by cops for smoking menthol cigarettes or having a pack on them. And it's very interesting, and I'm seeing this because this same thing, this is amazing, this same thing is playing out. When Al Sharpton was making this statement, there was absolutely no evidence, there was no examples of this actually happening. This was simply propaganda that he threw out there to make this argument, and there were people that believed it. Now, where have we seen this before in recent times, where a person just make a claim with no evidence and then have a host of people to believe it? Well, that's exactly the playbook that Al Sharpton used up in New York to say, hey, this is what's going to happen with absolutely no evidence whatsoever. Next slide, please. And another part of their, you know, argument that was part of the same thing was that there's going to be this criminalization of African-American young men. You know, we don't want to, they're going to target them for other petty crimes as a result of them possessing these mentholated tobacco products. Once again, absolutely no evidence of this. And I know there's no evidence, next slide, because I was able to actually confront Reverend Al Sharpton. This was an event that happened in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where they were making this argument of decriminalizing the Black community. And it just so happened that I was in Minneapolis when Al Sharpton came there with his team from Noble and other organizations. As you can see some of the names down there. They came and they were speaking at this church that was hosted. The pastor was Billy Russell. Well, it just so happens that we had connections in Minneapolis that were members of Pastor Billy Russell's church. And so we set up a meeting with Billy Russell the day before this meeting, that Nan was going to come to his church and talk about decriminalizing in the Black community. And so we told Billy Russell what that message was, and that there was no data, that there was no evidence to support this. And we said, hey, is it possible that we could be on this panel when they're making this argument? And he said, absolutely yes, you guys can be. He said, I didn't know this was happening. You can be a part of the panel. Now that's very interesting because I know that Dr. Phil and his group with the AATCLC, they actually tried to engage in conversation when this tour was going on in the Los Angeles, Oakland area. And what they did was when Dr. Yerger, who's also a member of the AATCLC, and Carol Magruder, when they tried to talk on the microphone and ask some questions, they turned the mic off. They wouldn't let them talk. They wouldn't even let them ask their questions to this panel. However, I was on stage with them. I got to be on the stage. And so as they were making their arguments, I gave the counter arguments, and I asked Reverend Al at that meeting, do you have any evidence to support your claims? And his answer was no. That's something we probably need to get. We probably need to get evidence to back and support this claim that we're making, was his response. And I just thought that that was absolutely incredible. Next slide, please. You know, it's absolutely incredible because they've played on, and they continue to play on, you know, issues that really have plagued our communities and bothered our communities. You know, you talk about police brutality and the like, and you talk about Eric Garner and how, you know, they're saying that he was selling Lucy cigarettes, and you talk about George Floyd and how they were saying that he actually was attempting to purchase a pack of Newports. with a counterfeit $20 bill that led to worldwide protests and unrest. And so it's interesting that when they're using that argument, this is something that is near and dear to our communities. And so it's not something that we take lightly, that you can just throw out these names. And they had went so far, as if I'm not mistaken, even when the Pallone bill, which passed last year, or in 2019, yes, and that's last year. I keep getting confused on years now with this COVID thing and being at home. I forget. That was last year when the Pallone bill was passed. They went out and got, if I'm not mistaken, it was Eric Garner's mom, and I think it was Trayvon Martin's mom, to be a part of their message and their propaganda to say, hey, no, we don't want to ban menthol and other flavored tobacco products because look what happened to our boys. Oh my goodness. How low can you really go in terms of propaganda? How low can you go is the only thing I can say. Next slide, which is how come, we were glad to be a part with the AATCLC and Counter Tools and even AHA and 30 other organizations to really come up with a blueprint for how do you enforce flavored tobacco products. And so we have this document, we've put it together. You've had experts in public health, you had experts that looked at equity issues. And like I said, I know that we've signed on to an AATCLC to say, wait a minute, this is how you enforce it. This is how you make sure that you don't criminalize African-American youth. And this is how you utilize police in these efforts, or don't utilize police in these other efforts where it's not really necessary. And so we've come out with this document. We're getting it right now to where it can be available on all of our websites and available to the general public. I don't think it's there yet. We're looking at early next year being able to release this to the general public, because it's something that we need to have in terms of how do we enforce it to ensure that no, we're not criminalizing African-American youth and other youth of color. If we could go to the next slide, please. And this, again, as Dr. Phil talked about, menthol is a social justice issue. And quite frankly, not banning menthol, leaving it on the market, is an example of systemic racism. You're using multiple systems to continue keeping African-American populations and other communities of color addicted to the menthol-related tobacco products. And so it's not one thing that's happening, but it's this combination of things that's happening that really enforces the systemic racism. The predatory marketing to the population, the advertising in these focus communities that we talked about, the price discounts in these communities, the sampling bans that we've talked about, donations to African-American organizations and our elected and our church officials, sponsorship of our community events, and then putting out these alternative facts with absolutely no evidence that they want us to buy into. This is a definition of systemic racism. It works in conjunction to keep our populations at bay. And so it's our job, both yours and mine together, to really build the capacity of our communities to understand this so that we can appropriately speak against it. Next slide, please. I think that's all I have. Yes, it is. And there is my contact information. And we'll be around for questions later. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. And, we will make these slides available to whoever would like them following this. And as I said, this is recorded, so you could share it as well. I emailed Delmonte this morning that last slide. I think that's such a great takeaway. If you just put that in your back pocket, it's a good one to have. Our next speaker is Representative Jill Krawinski. She's a longtime champion of tobacco prevention. She's from Burlington, Vermont, and has served in the House since 2012, and she was recently elected to become the next Speaker of the House for the upcoming session. She's Executive Director of Emerge Vermont, which is an organization that recruits and trains female Democratic candidates to run for political office. She previously served as House Majority Leader and worked at Planned Parenthood of Northern New England, and she will become just the fourth woman to be Speaker of the House of Representatives in Vermont, and we're glad to have her with us today.
Thank you, Tina. Thank you so much for inviting me. We've heard some powerful stories and facts here today, and I just want to thank everyone here who has been doing the hard work to protect youth from tobacco and vaping. Protecting youth from the dangers of tobacco and vaping has been a mission near and dear to me. As you've heard, I worked on these policies since I started in the legislature in 2012. I don't think most folks know this, that I started smoking when I was a senior in high school and was an on again, off again smoker until my late 20s. The more I learned about the health impacts and what tobacco companies were doing, I knew I had to stop. I'm proud of the work that we've done in the legislature, most recently raising the age to purchase tobacco to 21. However, clearly after everything we've heard, our work is not done. As you've heard, tobacco companies continue to market products to young people, especially young people of color. This is unacceptable. BIPOC youth already have so many barriers to overcome in our society. One statistic that has really struck me is that 7 out of 10 Black youth are smoking menthol. And so that this is clear that this is not only a public health issue, but a systemic racism issue as well, and we must act. I represent the Old North End in downtown Burlington, one of the most diverse legislative districts in the state. It's critical to me that we are doing everything we can to protect and empower BIPOC youth. And that's why I'm so proud of the students in Burlington who have launched the Our Lives, Our Lungs campaign. This campaign is created by Above the Influence BTV to encourage young people to speak out against big tobacco and the flavors big tobacco used to target youth and minority communities. When students have access to the facts, they can talk to their peers and spread the word in their communities. I am so honored and so excited to introduce to you Balkisa Omar, youth program leader from Burlington, and who is also an alumni of Burlington High School's Above the Influence program. Thank you so much for all you do and all your great work.
Hello, everyone. My name is Balkisa Omar, and I'm a student at the University of Vermont and work part-time with Burlington Partnership as their youth advisor. Next slide, please. I'm excited to be here today to talk about this project that our students at ATI worked on. ATI stands for Above the Influence. It's a drug prevention group supported by Burlington Partnership for a Healthy Community. I was a part of this group since 7th grade, and now I'm their advisor and have been in this role for the past 3 years now. We have this group available for middle schoolers at Edmonds Middle School as well as Hunt Middle School, and it's called Be Above. Through this group, our students are able to gain leadership skills, public speaking skills, and other abilities through the work they've done with ATI. Last year, our students went to the State House to advocate for policies that help support young people in making healthy choices regarding tobacco, alcohol, marijuana, and other drugs, which sparked an interest in this project. Next slide, please. We worked on this project last year, and our group looks a little different now as we're trying to see what this advocacy work looks like now with COVID. ATI is mainly youth-led because we understand that it's important to give them the leadership skills and have a voice in projects that they want to work on. There's tons of support from staff who help equip students with resources and opportunities to practice the skills that they have learned. This was a student-led project, and I met with them during lunch for a few weeks to flesh out their ideas and help make it come to real life. Next slide, please. After they created the script themselves, we took our students to the studio where they learned how to use the cameras and recorded each other and learned how to edit and put this whole project together from the start to the end. This project went beyond just our group. We tabled during lunch and their peers helped them stand up against big tobacco along with them. Our students were able to successfully portray emotions and how they felt about big tobacco while also being vulnerable and sharing their connection to this work and why it was important for them. They had fun doing this as they rotated roles so each person could experience different things. The reason our students created this video was to educate their community and peers about how big tobacco targets communities of colors at such higher rates and raise awareness about it using the hashtag #OurLives, We hope you guys will enjoy this video, learn from it, and also share it on your social medias using the hashtag #OurLives, to help us take a stand along with them. Thank you.
Big Tobacco's flavor game is not new. Big Tobacco has targeted minority communities with menthol products for decades. Menthol tobacco is easier to start, harder to quit, and just as deadly as non-flavored tobacco. I'm a Black Muslim woman. I face enough racism, sexism, and religious prejudices in my life. I see what Big Tobacco is doing and I'm not falling for it.
Because of Big Tobacco, my uncle is in a serious battle for his life. I need to speak out.
These are our lives, our lungs, and our voices will bring an end to all flavored tobacco.
Thank you, Balkisa. I just love that video. I've watched it over and over again, and there isn't a time I just don't get shook up about it. So it was wonderful. We do have some time for questions. I haven't watched the chat box to know if there are some that we haven't answered yet, but why don't you feel free to raise your hand and we'll let our speakers answer the questions. And then while the question's being asked, I'll go back to the chat box and see if there might be one that we missed. Any questions? I think that Dr. Zablocki had one in chat about whether, I think it was for Dr. Gardner maybe, whether you shared the information with Howard Medical and Dental School.
Well, I wrote back and said I certainly would love to do it if, could set something up. He responded saying that there'd been some difficulty in getting to them. I said, I'll call some people I know in the DC area and let's see what happens. But I do this around the country most of the time, so I'm sure we'll figure something out.
And if I could also add, Dr. Phil, Howard, of course, you're talking about Howard Medical School and Dental School because it's a Black organization and institution. And one of the things that we've also just had to be careful of and cautious of, and that is, as we shared, both of us talked about, is African-American systems, university system, churches, elected officials, receiving donations from the tobacco industry. And we can talk specifically about Meharry, which we know was the latest to receive this large donation from Juul, which in essence is the tobacco industry, and just being cautious about that, because as we even, after they received the donation, I know that our groups went to them to try and say, hey, wait a minute, this is not in the best interest of African-American health. But they were unresponsive. And so they've kept the money and they're continuing to work. And we know that they do other good things because we know that they're working with the COVID vaccine and the clinical trials. But on the tobacco issue, we still just have to cautiously walk that line because some of them are still receiving money from the industry.
We do have a question from Courtney that said, what are some suggestions around building protective factors with BIPOC students? I can start to answer that briefly. I think we are working with Senator Lyons, as she mentioned earlier, to eliminate what's called PUP provisions, purchase, use, and possession penalties for youth. There isn't scientific evidence that these really work in terms of being a deterrent to students, and we would like to have them removed from Vermont statute currently. So that may be a starting point for sure. I don't know if any of our speakers wanted to address that as well.
I would like to address it. Delmonte mentioned the piece we worked on with the American Public Health Association's Alcohol and Tobacco and Other Drugs subcommittee. There needs to be the complete decriminalization of commercial tobacco products. And there's like with the period there. What ends up happening is that you have the from the store to the jail conveyor belt going on. The store gets targeted for selling cigarettes to somebody they shouldn't. The clerk gets arrested, not arrested, gets fined, and the second fine is much larger. If this person's a young person of color, maybe them have gotten stopped at some other point. They've got 3 arrest records on their case. They end up going to jail, and all because of cigarettes. Cigarettes should not be criminalized. There's no reason for people to be arrested for the possession of them. We can think of other things to do. People can be involved in educational programs. People can be involved in what we've done here in California in butt cleanups, where you go around and clean up the area around the school or wherever they are arrested. In terms of that, there's actually meeting and talking with the police department about this, that this should be truly one of the lowest priority things on their agenda, given all the stuff that's going on now. So I just really want to enforce what folks are talking about. It would be great if in Vermont, not to mention the United States, but that's a way off, that let's stop arresting youth for possession. Let's stop arresting youth for use. Why are we arresting them? There's so many other things that could be done. Enough. I just needed to say that.
And if I could just add one small piece also, I think Balkisa and the Above the Fluence, they really illustrated that you've got such an amazing protective factor with information. Sharing them this information here and other information like it, and they'll take it and they'll run with it. They'll protect us if they've got the right information. So let's keep giving them the information that they need to protect us all.
Sorry, muted myself. Allison asked, can someone please remind me of what's on the agenda for Vermont legislature in the coming session? Where is the flavors bill at, specifically menthol? I had a conversation with Senator Westman and some youth about it. I can quickly say that. You know what, I'll turn that over actually to Senator Lyons, since she was the sponsor of the legislation in the Senate this year and last year, the beginning of the year, and can give an update kind of where it landed.
So I guess the question is about what's coming up on the agenda. Recall what I said earlier is that the bill ended up in the Finance Committee, where their discussion and the debate was around lost revenue versus other financial issues related to menthol and flavors overall. So it was in some ways stuck there, but in other ways it was stuck there because of the pandemic. I am introducing the bill as it left our committee, and we did have a unanimous vote in our committee. I am introducing that bill again, but the issue, I'm working on it today actually with my legal counsel in the State House. The question that we have to answer is the relative value of the long-term gains for public health and racial equity and systemic racism. And then the question about economics, revenue for the state in a time of real economic downturn. But you know where this group is wholeheartedly in favor of moving the bill forward with alacrity. So that's where it is. And I don't know what your conversation was with Senator Westman or the youth, but I would be interested to know what that conversation was. Senator Westman is on my committee. He did vote for the bill, and but there were reservations about menthol, and as I indicated earlier, the argument that we never heard in committee, but was made quite clear in the hallway, was that menthol helps people quit for adults. And it just seems like one of those fallacies and myths that perpetuate. So there you go. We'll be working hard on this, and I know Representative Brumstead in the House will be working with us as well. You're welcome.
And I did want to recognize Representative Brumstead and Representative Till, both were sponsors of the House bill. If you want to say a few words, that would be great.
I don't know if Representative Till is here, but I will say that this time around, we're going to do it a little differently. Last time we both introduced bills, both on the House and the Senate. This time we're hoping that Senator Lyons, because so much work has already been done, it'll move quickly through, and we'll be able to take up the bill as amended as it is and immediately react to that. I know that our committee is interested in continuing to move forward. So I have a feeling that we'll be able, we'll have though the similar issues to Senator Lyons in the full House. There will be a lot of questions about the menthol piece, because as we know, there's still, everyone seems very supportive of banning flavors for e-cigarettes, but people are very, sort of ingrained in their what they do smoke, and that's a lot harder. It's a heavier lift, but as we've seen today, it's a worthwhile lift, and we will do our best to get that through. So thank you for all this information today. We'll be calling on you to help us as we take on some of those fallacies that are out there. Thank you.
If I could add something, Representative Brumstead and Lyons, and this is just as a point of reference. As you all know, language matters. It matters a lot how you say things and what it is that you say. And so as legislation is going forward, and if you're going to say that you're putting forth flavored legislation, I would ask you, please, instead of saying including menthol and having menthol as an afterthought, say one of two things. Either say menthol and other flavored tobacco products, so that menthol is at the front end of it as opposed to becoming an afterthought, or say flavored tobacco products, especially menthol. Especially carries a different connotation than including menthol. If you were to say especially menthol, it shows that you really need to address this, and it puts a focus on menthol. So that's just a tidbit in terms of trying to wordsmith things so that you can put the focus on where it needs to be, and that is on the menthol. I have to put it first.
Thank you.
Especially.
Thank you, Delmonte, for saying that. I'll even take it a step further. My sense is, I think your first one is the most important. This is menthol and all flavored tobacco products, not and flavored tobacco products, because then there's no room. It's just menthol and all flavored tobacco products. There's a period there that includes all the cigarettes and little cigars and the sometimes we even say menthol, cigarettes, flavored cigars, and all other flavored tobacco products. So, but just getting menthol, I think Delmonte's point, we've had this discussion a number of years. We always put menthol first. It keeps the ball bouncing, keep the focus alive on it.
Thank you for that. Right now the bill is entitled banning flavored tobacco and e-liquids, but it'll be very simple to make that correction. I appreciate that very much.
Those are great suggestions, and we will start talking about it that way for sure. And I do want to recognize Representative Till, who has his hand raised, so he can jump into the conversation.
Oh, thank you, Tina, and thank you for putting this all together. It's been really worthwhile. Thank you to the presenters. We do appreciate that. I have been a tobacco advocate for quite a while, obviously, and I think some of the information you presented about how much harder it is to quit with the menthol, I think is important to counteract some of the misinformation put out there by some of the lobbyists in the building. The second thing I want to say is that it might be helpful if we put together a common message that we all have in terms of the financial impact of the revenue lost, and that there are other potential replacements which aid health instead of hurt health. Things like, you know, we've had the sugar sweetened beverage battles, but that, you know, obviously that taxing that would more than replace what we lose from the menthol cigarettes. Also, putting the sales tax on candy would go a long way to replacing the lost revenues. So I think it might be worthwhile with the advocates and the people in the building that we put together a unified message about how we deal with the potential lost revenue and shut that up right away. Thanks.
Thank you. We can certainly do that. And one other source of revenue that I know Representative Till has supported, because he has legislation every year since I can remember about this. This is a great idea, is a tobacco tax. And just $1 increase in Vermont would raise about a little over $6 million, which, you know, that's a great amount to cover the $5 million that may be lost by removing the sale of flavored tobacco. I wanted, and I mentioned it earlier, and I think Senator Lyons mentioned it earlier too, but it's not insignificant that we spend $348 million treating the chronic diseases caused by tobacco use. Now, Dr. Valenti couldn't join us today. She's a very respected researcher on this issue, but one of the things she provided us both in testimony earlier before Senator Lyons' committee this winter, and has talked about since then, is Ontario did ban the sale of menthol cigarettes. And after a month following that, when that went into effect, they looked at kind of what they predicted would happen with menthol smokers and then what actually happened. And it was about 28% of menthol smokers went to non-menthol cigarettes instead of the menthol cigarettes that were banned. About 29% quit, and about 29% went to an alternative flavored tobacco product. So in that case, it appears that there's some progress, and it's helping people to quit. Some did move, so there's continues to be sales of some, not that we love that, but continue to be sales of tobacco products. But people quit, and it's significant. And of course, you know, this isn't all based on science, right? But if there's as we saw earlier, menthol sales make up about 35% of sales of tobacco products. So if we have our $348 million figure of healthcare costs, we have 35% of those that smoke menthol, and then maybe around a third of those quit. We're talking about $35 million. So, you know, it's probably not that amount of money, but it's going to be more than pocket change for sure. And I think what's more important than the money is the folks that we have all been talking about today during this webinar. And I asked Rebecca to pull my last slide up because, you know, we went quickly and you probably didn't have a chance to see what's underneath Shamura's picture, but she is one of the students who worked with Balkisa on that wonderful video with the Above the Influence group. And this quote was from the testimony they gave before the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. I'm going to read it because you know, it's from her heart and it's real. Big tobacco has fed off of addiction for decades and has taken the lives of so many in our community. And all for what? Money. What about the lives of youth and adults and future generations? There is not enough money in the world the tobacco industry can give back to these struggling communities to make up for the lives they have taken. And I think Shamura is who we need to think about when we talk about this legislation moving forward. It's not about ensuring that we have $5 million in revenue from tobacco sales. It really isn't. It's about what we were talking about today. So we still have a little bit of time left if there are any questions. I haven't watched the chat box to know if we have one in there. I think that we addressed them all. Yeah.
Hey Tina, Tina, there was a question in the chat box that talked about the how do we make sure that this issue doesn't get lost because of everything that's going on with COVID. And real quickly, and I'm sure that Dr. Phil would like to respond to that too. And all I'll say is these issues are related. And so it's not, you know, one of those, let's do COVID or let's look at menthol, but these issues are related. And if we look at that intersection, I think we're doing ourselves a big favor by tying these things in together.
Yes.
Yeah, I could, well said, Delmonte, actually, and I said this to Tina, when I do this, my presentation, that was, usually takes about 45 minutes to 50 minutes. You got the condensed version. We didn't get to go over all the points. I mean, you might look at it this way, that African Americans, Latinx community, LGBT folks are dying disproportionately of COVID. These same groups disproportionately use menthol cigarettes. We kind of look at it this way, that menthol cigarettes is the main vector of death and disease into the Black community. And nothing, and the COVID-19 crisis have actually exposed the disparities that we've been living with for hundreds of years. If there's anything that would make Black Lives Matter and give Black lives more meaning, it would be to get menthol cigarettes and flavored little cigars out of our communities. The Respiratory Journal the European Respiratory Journal had an article in there in July or May and July on COVID-19. And it said that smokers and folks with COPD attract the virus more. They develop receptors in their lungs that are attracted to the COVID-19 virus. Look at it. Latinx people and Black people disproportionately have the highest rates of COPD. They are disproportionately, it just, are they related, Delmonte? Yes, they are definitely related. In fact, we were able, and I'll shut up after this. In Oakland moved to take out the loopholes it had in some local legislation. And all this discussion, and this was this was in May, in the midst of the COVID-19 scare, we were able to convince people that it's much more important to get people to quit smoking menthol and everything else in the midst of the pandemic. The vote was initially 5-3, the vote passed unanimously. So I think they're not only linked, they actually can be to our benefit.
So as a number of our speakers have mentioned already, it's not just this issue. We have so many tobacco policy issues that are intertwined. One more I do want to raise during this call, because it will be equally important, I believe, is funding for Vermont's tobacco control program. It's a wonderful program that has helped people quit for years. Early evaluation over the first 14 years of the program showed that saved like $1.7 billion with a $73 million investment. It is so worth the investment. We will, and our partners with the Coalition for Tobacco-Free Vermont, will talk to legislators about not only preserving it, but it makes sense to put more money to it with these very issues that we're talking about, and with COVID and people's fear of contracting the virus when they're smokers. The Vermont Health Department every week does a weekly update of, who are the patients that got COVID and what's going on with them and what are the underlying health conditions. And it changes a little bit week to week, but it's always been around 50% of those people have underlying health conditions, as our speakers have talked about. And topping the list usually is that the biggest group is former or current smokers. So we have to address this, and spending money in a pandemic on prevention and media to ensure that kids don't want to quit. We talk about the dangers of it, makes perfect sense. And we got some funding thanks to the good work Vermont has done and enforcing the provisions of the Master Settlement Agreement with the tobacco industry. $10.5 million we had not anticipated will come as a result of that. Some of that should go to help these help with this issue. So we are getting close on our time. We have about 5 minutes left. So if anyone does have some more questions, I'd be happy to take them. Yes, of course.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to comment on the question around the pandemic and menthol related issues. And I was going to bring up the same article that Dr. Gardner brought up, so I'm glad you did. And it's something I think we should be looking at as we begin taking testimony. The other, to step back, I think the pandemic has, if there's any value in it, for me, it's been the value of raising public health as a significant issue. And then when we look down further into the data and analyze how this pandemic has disproportionately affected our African American, our Black population, our BIPOC populations, it is a travesty that we allow for tobacco-related health problems and tobacco to continue to do this to these populations. And so I'm, but the value of elevating public health in people's minds is significant. And I believe it's really going to be important for us to stick with the message that public health prevention is so critically important.
I think we all largely agree with that. It's a great message. I do want to point out the article above the one that the Bloomberg article in there, one that I popped in the chat box, is our presidential advisory on structural racism. It's talking a lot about what we talked about today. And I encourage, you need a few minutes to read it, so budget a little bit of time, but it's a great piece, and I'm proud to be part of an organization that has made such a commitment to that, to addressing racial inequities and health in many areas. And as I mentioned when I started this, we can't leave menthol off the table. It was done before, and if you remember that slide of Dr. Gardner's, the 5% use rate in the early 50s is now 85% and will continue to rise. We're not doing anybody any favors by allowing them to keep their menthol. Anybody who knows a smoker who smokes menthol can attest to that. So thank you very much. If you come up with questions that we haven't answered, please email me. I will share slides with anybody. I'll put my email here in the chat box, but you can also call me at any time. And there you go. And I'm very grateful and thankful to our participants today. It was a great conversation. So with that, I'll let everyone enjoy the rest of their day. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.